They were the sort of thinkers behind all this, and they still are. So, and what this tradition was saying is that politically, these people were refusing to fight the wars of capitalism. They were refusing to fight the Vietnam War. The ones that I met were on the run from American militarism and wanted a different way. And they were dissenters against militarism. So peace was essential to them. And I think the love of the goddess goes with that, because the goddess is a word for nature. It's the revitalization of nature, the anima mundi, to use Jung's word. Every atom in nature is sacred. And if we know that, just as when you're in love with a woman or a man, you don't want to harm them. You love and appreciate everything about them. So if we see the whole world as a goddess, a living body of one divine being, Gaia, we don't want to harm it. And that brings an ecological lifestyle and an ethic of compassion and caring, which is implicit in all religions. A lot of these people then went on and founded the electronic revolution. I mean, Apple, Microsoft, the things we rely on, the internet, was a brainchild of the hippies who saw, well, let's make this dream of unity real. Let's manifest this noetic integrity of humanity. And I find it sad that people now misuse those vehicles to spread lies, disinformation, disharmony. It's like Putin and his types have not been reading the hippie scripts. I feel very sad for that. And I wish he'd go back to college and just do some training, retraining. There ought to be a system for retraining politicians that make mistakes. Like Netanyahu's another. He should just be sacked and go back to school. I'm proposing that politicians should have a license, which should be issued by responsible authorities. And if they lie and misuse funds and do corruption and lie and cheat and steal, they lose the license. It's as simple as that. That's what cops, you have to have a license to work as a policeman. If you do any of those things, you get sacked. I, as a teacher, if I do wrong things, I get sacked as a teacher. I can't work anymore. I get a black mark against my name. Why should politicians be any different? They're the most powerful group, and yet at the moment they're not licensed. They can do what they want. Well, no, enough is enough. So the goddess tradition, it's alive and well. That's why I worked with the Stonehenge campaign. In Britain, there was a kind of offshoot of this. Assorted hippie goddess worshippers used to go to Stonehenge for the summer solstice. And in 1985, they were arrested en masse at a thing called the Battle of the Beanfield. Margaret Thatcher and her police cronies corralled a whole, a train of vehicles in which these people were living. It was their homes, who were going to Stonehenge for the solstice to celebrate. And they forced them into a beanfield and then trashed the vans and smashed the glass, hurt and injured hundreds of people, women and children, and arrested them en masse and stuck them in jails all over the southeast of England. Like 800 people were put in prison, including some of my friends. And so that was Thatcher trying to stamp out the hippie movement, because she saw it as a threat to her very narrow-minded, sort of capitalist Christian worldview based on her own narrow interpretation of Methodism. So I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Stonehenge. We've had 30 meetings in the UK, which I've chaired in Wiltshire, and I've met people who were in that Battle of the Beanfield, who told me what it was like, and that was the archetypal clash in the UK between these two worldviews. And I can see it as ever as a good Jain philosopher. I can see it from all sides, but I have to say I think the poor old hippies have been very badly done by. Okay, so that's that lot. And there are many, I could mention the Beatles, the importance of music. Bob Dylan, these were their bards, if you want, singing out for a new world of peace and love. The Grateful Dead was an important group for this movement, and figures like Merlin Stone and Monica Saju were their intellectual heavyweights working in the feminist theological tradition. Gordon Wasson was providing evidence about the role of psychedelics in history, that it was part of the ancient goddess cultures of Eleusis in Athens. So Pericles and the great Athenian intellectuals like Plato and Aristotle went to the mysteries. So when the hippies of California are saying, let's try acid, it really is interesting. They were just saying, let's have our birthright, as if we are here in ancient Athens. Woody Guthrie was another of the bards, if you want. Aldous Huxley was one of the intellectuals that provided their framework, which he called the perennial philosophy. So the perennial philosophy, by definition, is eternal. It's always been there. It's like the hydrogen of thought. Ram Dass became one of the great spokespersons for this. I think he's still alive. Bless him, Ram Dass. Hope so. And Timothy Leary, of course, discovering the psychological impact of LSD with Ram Dass at Harvard, realised that it brought spirituality as a direct lived experience to people, which was both dangerous if not done properly, but also liberating if done properly. So, yes, Haight-Ashbury was the place where it was going on, and when I went to California and went to Haight-Ashbury, I was a bit late. I didn't get there until 1992. Can you believe it? I said, I was sitting in a cafe in the middle of Haight-Ashbury. I said to this hippie-looking chap, well, what's happening these days? Have I missed anything? And he told me, yes, you should read Terence McKenna, who I'd never heard of. And I did. And Terence McKenna was the intellectual who, the latter day sort of tradition of the hippie movement, he wrote brilliant books, The Food of the Gods and others, about setting this. Basically his argument is that our ancestors, Homo sapiens, were experimenting with psychedelic mushrooms and other things in North Africa about 6000 BC, as illustrated on cave walls, and that this was the explanation for why we had this sudden influx of consciousness and language. Basically, our ancestors discovered what it was like to be high, because you can think very, very profound thoughts. Whereas if you're just roaming around, sort of hunting game all the time, you don't have time for that. So they discovered, that was Terence McKenna's argument, which is worth considering and worth looking at. And there have been others since then. Okay, so that's that, and we can go on about that, but I'll just say that blends in with the indigenous traditions of the world. So a lot of people then went down to Peru and Ecuador and explored ayahuasca and realised that the native shamans have been doing this all along for millennia. And in the American Indian culture, Panchamama, the Earth Mother, is the giver of vision. And our duty is piety and reverence to the goddess, so that the visions are granted to us. That's the function of the medicine man or the medicine woman. And so really, I think this hippie movement was quite interesting. That's why I call it eclectic goddess worship, because that ultimately is what it's blended into. And long may it flourish and, sharpen its act. Now, the other one we're going to look at is Sunni Islam, which you might say, God, they're totally opposite. They're completely antithetical, and no wonder there's a kind of war between the West and Islam or whatever. But I'm going to argue that this is a mistake, because people haven't been doing the research. And that's why I spent 10 years doing a commentary on the Quran, going into it in depth. And I've met many, famous Muslim intellectuals, philosophers, and Sufis, practitioners who've influenced me and inspired me. And so the fruits of what I've learned from them, basically, Muhammad was, an eclectic goddess worshipper in his own way. He didn't use that language for historical and conceptual reasons, but fundamentally that's where his heart was. What he was saying, like any genuine hippie, was let's all get together and live in peace. Let's have, fraternity among all the peoples. It doesn't matter what your religion is. Let's surrender to the absolute. That's the piety bit. Let's surrender to the infinite creative intelligence behind the universe. Let's acknowledge it exists. And then let's surrender to it, because our egos can't make the journey. The ego won't survive this encounter with the absolute. It has to be dissolved, and that's what happens with the the experience of LSD or the other ayahuasca and so on. And you find instead the totality of everything is inside each one of us. Now, all the evidence is that Muhammad had those experiences in the cave on his meditation retreats. He encountered the absolute. And from there, these amazing verses came down. He channeled, we would say, these incredible verses from that place of absolute unity. Like, imagine Ram Dass, Timothy Leary, Stephen Gaskin, Terence McKenna, all fused into one, and then sending messages down, to Muhammad. That's what he got. So I was amazed when I started my commentary on the Quran how incredibly profound and deep these verses are, and how there are so many layers of meaning in them. I was also pleasantly, deeply surprised when I realised that's what the Sufis have been saying all along. There are 7 levels of meaning in the Quran that you can go into if you have the patience and the piety, and then more levels of meaning will be revealed to you. So I discovered what I did in my commentary was I approached it as an intellectual historian, so I wanted to put it into chronological sequence. The Quran that we have is not in chronological sequence. It's by order of the length of the surahs. Fine, that's just a way of ordering texts, right? Because in traditional Islamic perspective, they all come simultaneously from God, so it doesn't matter what order they're in. But I'm writing it as an intellectual historian. I'm saying actually it does matter, because I want to see how Muhammad evolved as a prophet during his prophetic career. And so what verses he got at this year versus that year versus this year, that's his grounding it historically. I also went into the missing years of Muhammad, because he spent 15 years as a husband and partner and business partner of Khadija, who was the greatest single influence on him intellectually. And he was travelling all around Arabia, and he was meeting and encountering Christians, Manichaeans, different Eastern types of Christians, Nestorians. He was meeting Gnostics, of which Khadija was one. She was a kind of Gnostic Christian. He was meeting Jews of different varieties. He was meeting Zoroastrians. And he was meeting pagans. And all this was like amazing to him. He didn't read, but he had a very acute intelligence, and so he absorbed all this learning. And that went into his, what Jung would call the unconscious. And then out of it comes this, 15 years later, the Quran starts to arrive. So in my commentary, I go into all this in depth. No other scholars have ever done or attempted this. I think I've tried to explain Muhammad and Islam in a way that Terence McKenna, sitting in a cafe in Haight-Ashbury, would get it, would understand what's going on here. But also in a way that every Muslim on the planet can also get it. They can understand what Muhammad was trying to do. Muhammad was not saying go out and slaughter everyone that doesn't grow their beard in the right way or doesn't do exactly the right prayer movements. No. He was talking about, purity of heart, establishing this very subtle spiritual submission to the absolute, which is what Islam means. It means you surrender your ego and you live transparently to spirit. And he taught that also as a practice to his close circle, who became the inner companions, the Sufis, above all to his wife Khadija and him, who explored this together, and then his daughter Fatima and his son-in-law Ali, who received these teachings. And in fact, Ali did do a chronological reordering of the entire Quran. Before he died, he was murdered by ignorant people who were pseudo-Muslims, pretending to be Muslims who weren't, because it became a big thing politically to be a Muslim. It meant you got more camels, you had access to more money, you got taxes, That was all the wrong reasons. Muhammad was on the side of the poor, the widows, the defenceless, and he was probably murdered in the end, poisoned. He died quite young, in his early 60s, and the evidence points to the fact Muhammad was himself murdered by, he had many enemies who didn't want to hear this news about the importance of the surrender of the ego to the absolute, for all kinds of reasons. But the human reason is that people don't, they don't actually want to be good. They see that being evil is a much better way to get on in life. You can amass palaces and empires and armies and, etc., etc. Well, Muhammad was saying no to all that. So, of course, he was poisoned. And the true followers that came, like Ali and others, they themselves were martyred. Tragically. I mean, it's a shocking, tragic story that unfolded. Now, the group that that sort of seized power in the wake of Muhammad's revelatory teachings were essentially associated with his last wife, Aisha, who was a young girl who didn't have the intellectual capacity to really understand what was going on, but she had a faith in Muhammad, she loved him deeply, and she just trusted. I think she was, a true Muslim, but she didn't have the intelligence to understand what it meant to be a true Muslim. She was hung up on the outer actions. She thought it meant shaving your beard in a particular way, praying 5 times a day in a particular way, doing everything in the right way, sort of creating a code of actions, rather than realizing, no, it's about the spiritual intention behind it. And that knowledge ended up in the hands of the Sufi tradition and the philosophical traditions of Islam. The kind of let's do it by the book tradition became known as the Sunni tradition. And of course they then created the hadith as a very important add-on to follow. So you have to not just follow the Quran, you have to do everything the way Muhammad did. If he combed his hair in a certain way, you have to do the same. If he said, when you can eat, you have to do the same. In other words, it became a sort of copycat thing, which, with all due respect, is a bit ridiculous. It's like somebody saying we should all brush our hair the way Terence McKenna did, or Jack Kerouac. No, we're all individuals. Surely that's part of God's plan for humanity. Everybody is unique and individual. We have to do it our way. But what we do have to do in common is this surrender, submission of ego to the absolute, which brings with it the peace that is Islam, and which is there in other traditions. It's called the Shekinah in Islam, in several Quranic verses. This beautiful peace descends. Interestingly enough, that's the same root as the word the Shekinah in Hebrew thought, which means the descent of the goddess. The Shekinah is the other side of God, because in Judaism they know there's a feminine side of God as well. Okay, so cut a long story short, I think the inspiration behind the Sunni tradition was fine. They were trying to be faithful to what Muhammad had brought, and they became great scholars. They appreciated the wisdom of other peoples, like the Greeks. They translated Greek works into Arabic. They became highly intellectual, and they set up the Cordoba, caliphate in Spain, which lasted 700 years, where they translated many great Greek works into Arabic, and then they were translated on into Latin, which gave rise to the Renaissance in 12th century Europe. The University of Paris and Oxford were founded because of Spain, where Alfonso the Wise, the greatest Spanish king, had been translating these works. He had a school of translators in Toledo, working away. And that's where the people in Cluny got the Quran from. So, you know, I think scholarship somewhere got lost into thinking we're all different and therefore we have to be rivals and compete. What I think we should be saying is we're all actually, you know, lost in space, trying to find the path to true piety and true wisdom and true enlightenment. And each of these boxes is a help on the path. And if you go into it really deeply, you find that they're saying the same thing, just in different languages, different cultures. So the Muslim Brotherhood was an offshoot of Sunnism in the 20th century. They made an intellectual error, I believe, in saying that the West was evil, unconditionally and absolutely. I think it was Muhammad Qutb was the name of the chap. He went and did a scholarship in America, and he was out, he couldn't understand it culturally. He couldn't understand why there were bars which allowed women to be in, why women were walking around, you know, without veils. He couldn't understand, you know, pop music. He thought the whole thing was corrupt and evil. So he came back and preached a very strict form of Islam. He said, hey lads, we have to hate the West. We have to reaffirm all that's good about our culture. Keep our women in veils. Don't let them wear short skirts or any of that evil nonsense the West is doing. And he sort of intellectually declared war on the West. Now, and essentially kind of war on women, actually. And they became very strict, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, promoting regimes in the Islamic world that adhered to that ideology, a very strict interpretation of Sunnism. Well, I think that was a mistake. I think that the poor chap, you know, didn't understand the West, wasn't taught properly. I think he didn't do any proper studies. I don't think the guy had ever discovered Goethe or Shakespeare or Dante, or let alone the hippie intellectuals that I've talked about. I mean, he came a bit before them. But I used to teach a course on Western philosophy to the Muslim College in London, to Islamic students, when I was working at the University of London as a lecturer. And that was a very interesting experience, teaching Syrian, Afghan, you know, Arabic-speaking intellectuals. They all had degrees. They were doing like a master's degree. And my job was to explain Western philosophy to them. So I had to explain Kant and Freud and Marx and Nietzsche in a way that Muslim intellectuals could understand. And that was a really interesting experience for me. And it is possible to do that. I did it. And I'm still friends with many of those students. But you know, that was quite unique what I was doing, because the Muslim College in London was run by Dr. Zaki Badawi, a liberal Muslim who was a true Muslim and a real believer in freedom of thought and freedom of spiritual experience, which is, you know, you can't have fake surrender of the ego by definition. I mean, there's a famous poem by Rumi. He says, the unbeliever hides his unbelief. Whereas a true believer, if they have doubts and don't believe something, they're honest because they want to get to a place of genuine surrender. So and unfortunately, the people behind the Muslim Brotherhood didn't get all this. They didn't get my teaching. They didn't meet people like me. There are true Muslim and Western intellectuals that could have explained this to them, and they would have got the point of the West, which is to explore liberty of ideas, freedom of thought, to come back round to surrender through the path of liberation. You know, in a sense, Nietzsche's idea, God is dead, that was a phase we had to go through to rediscover the authenticity of actual spirituality. And the existentialist movement as well was important. And that inspired lots of Islamic intellectuals in Egypt and places. But the Muslim Brotherhood, no, they wouldn't look at those books. They would say, heresy, heresy, you know. So we have a problem because, and one of the reasons why I do the Philosophy Club is to try and bridge these gaps, because, yeah, it's important. I think in France here we have a more intelligent kind of lineage of Islamic intellectuals who are working with French intellectuals I've known several of these over the years, and we have in the Grand Mosque de Paris, a great Islamic centre. There's a centre for Islamic and civilization in Paris, and also a centre for Arab culture. So, there are great French intellectuals that realise that secular French intellectual society isn't a threat or challenge to authentic Islam. And therefore this debate between secularism and Islam is actually bridgeable, but only at the highest level. Anyway, that's my attempt. Does that make sense of this? Explain it a little. I won't do the lecture in French, but it might it'll be interesting. Okay, so those two are interesting, I think. Thank you for choosing that one. And right, let's move on to our Tarot of the Gods. This is a very kind of Californian project, and it took me 2 years to write the books for the Tarot of the Gods and research them all. But it took me about 40 years of research beforehand to really come up with an understanding of what they are. And I think the Tarot are interesting because they've been around since the Enlightenment, and then before that in Renaissance Italy. And there seems to be a lineage going back to Hermetic Egypt, these cards. So they have their own lineage. I'll let you choose one first.
Elohim.
Okay, Elohim, that's a good one. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Huh. We've had him recently, we won't have him. I like to try and vary them a bit. Okay, we'll have this one then. Yes. Ha. Okay, well, we have the 10, the major arcana, which is called in the Tarot of the Gods Elohim, and stands for the gods, actually. Elohim's a plural word.
What is 10?
It's part of what's called the major arcana, and it's number 10 in the sequence of 21 major cards in the tarot, which are called the major arcana, the major mysteries. Okay. The number 10 in most tarot is called the Wheel of Fortune, and it's a diagram like a wheel. Well, so what I've done in these Tarot of the Gods is I've chosen the god that fits that tarot closely, and I've argued that the Elohim is the best example because the gods, Elohim, plural, are on their own Wheel of Fortune. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. Poor old Ahura Mazda used to be the god of the greatest empire in the world, being worshipped everywhere. Now he's down to a few 100,000 Zoroastrians that keep burning flames to him. So he's going down on the Wheel of Fortune. But maybe he'll come back up, you never know. And Yahweh, has gone through his ups and downs as well. And all the gods, they're in or they're out. Lu, who used to be the great god of the sun from Celtic Europe, gave his name to Lyon and London and Carlisle, was worshipped everywhere from, Switzerland and Spain and all of Gaul, all the way up to Ireland, Scotland, and had temples and priesthoods and so on. He's now down to just a few hundred or a few thousand druids that even remember his name. So that's why the Elohim are the Wheel of Fortune. And I think that it's also interesting because Elohim is used in the Bible text. And in fact, the term is in Genesis, in the Bible, in Hebrew version, where it says, and God created the heavens and the earth. And the Elohim created the heavens and the earth. So it should be translated, the gods translated the heavens and the earth, created the heavens and earth. And Elohim includes the feminine as well as the masculine aspects of the deity. So any self-respecting hippie sitting in Haight-Ashbury studying the Kabbalah would immediately understand the Elohim are pretty, that's who we all worship in effect, because all the gods come into that bracket of the Elohim. It's not a name, it's a generic term for the gods in Hebrew. And it's the same as the root for the word Allah. In a sense, Allah is one of the Elohim, but all the others count as well. So, I think what this card is saying is that we have to get back to worshipping the authentic creator, the Elohim, the absolute, which comes, this is an interesting bit, the absolute comes in a plural form. So one of the big problems, and this is a mathematical problem I've talked about in my book on religious maths, one of the problems is the war that's going on between the monofideists, as I call them, who think you have to be faithful to just one thing, and the polyfideists, who think, no, you can be faithful to more. I believe that we need to become more mature as a human civilization and realise that polyfideism, being faithful to many, is a path to the higher octave of monofideism. Because by being faithful to all the Elohim, we find the divine unity, which ultimately they know about. We humans can only glimpse that occasionally. We don't know all the numbers yet to compute them. But that's the logos in the mind of God, if you want to use theological terms, that divine unity, which is also plurality. And so that Elohim is, it's pretty important, really. And I think what the card is saying is that we need to wake up to that true piety, which includes everybody, every religion. That's why I've done the periodic table. Every faith tradition, including the secularists, including the Nietzscheans, including the existentialists who sit in their cafes smoking gauloises saying, no, there's no God, I'm reading Sartre. Okay, they're welcome to the party too, because they're part of this magical display the Elohim have created. Okay, and what's the other one? Well, this one, the Knight of Air, this is Quetzalcoatl, who is a Latin American deity, very important one, from different parts of Central and South America. And he's very important as a spiritual being in the consciousness of the Central and South American peoples. To this day, there are still indigenous native shamans and medicine people that understand Quetzalcoatl's power and revere it. He stands for the breeze, the fertile breeze that comes, bringing gentle rains. One definition of why he's the Knight of Air in the tarot, in the four elements, is because he is that beautiful summer breeze that comes bringing rain in a very hot, dry climate like Mexico or whatever. You need Quetzalcoatl to bring in from the sea the cooling breeze that then guarantees the crops and the fertility of the soil. He's also called the Feathered Serpent, and that seems to be a reference to the chakra system, the serpent energy of Kundalini in Eastern Oriental philosophy. Seems to have been understood also in Latin America. And Quetzalcoatl is the lord of the serpent energy, the feathered serpent, who brings enlightenment to the people. He's on the side of humanity. And we know that in Mexico, the worship of